One of the most asked questions in my Discord DMs is how do I play Longsword and what skills I use. Even though I have one of the more detailed guides on the old Longsword, I was not sure if I have fully mastered the new Longsword to make a guide for it. So as part of my procrastination, I started gathering data on how well my Longsword performed in this season's rank games. What I found was surprising to say the least. So how did I do and how did others Longswords fare? And what is the current hero balance of the game? I have some insights, and let's start with the data I gathered. You know how the game provides you with a stat review at the end of every battle? This includes your hero's damage and damage taken. So what I did was compile a list of the 5 best performing heroes on each team and recorded data in 16 ranked matches. These matches took me to the Marshal rank, so expect that these players are some of the best in the game doing their best with their heroes and units. Here's the data for the damage dealt and damage taken per minute. First, the damage dealt. For ranged weapons, longbows are undoubtedly the best damage dealers in the game because they can deal damage consistently throughout the entire game. Not surprising. The second is dual blades. Yes, they are a ranged unit now, just got a massive buff to their bow shuriken so they can now deal absurd range damage, which the best players took advantage of in ranked games. This is reflected in their high damage output. As for melee heroes, not Nodachi's are the best, but they need to keep in mind how much damage they can take in return. They have great potential, but it's not a class for the undedicated, as the stats for Nodachis are all over the place. Some just have bad numbers even though they get top 5, but the best have staggeringly high damage numbers. Mole reigns supreme as speculated by everyone, but now backed by data. They are indeed outdamaging everything else while being extremely tanky in the best of hands. Why? Because their massive blunt AoE and block break that counters the meta units like Men-at-Arms. As for my weapon of choice, the Longsword, the average good player deals the lowest amount of damage in the game. This is not surprising either, as the usual longsword player plays for their survivability more than their ability to deal damage. But then there is me at 21,000 damage per minute right behind Mauls, almost doubling the average longsword player. This is very surprising as it tells me that longsword players can do much more in battle, and indeed I am doing some things right. Next is damage taken. Heavy armor takes the cake and eats it whole, again confirming the game's bias towards heavy armor. They are the most played and popular class. The short sword as king of damage taken are worthy title because of their Ironside skill. As for the long swords, they are just marginally better than Mauls, partly due to their ability to block attacks which does not get reflected in these stats, but I also have the suspicion that most longsword players don't use longswords for their skills, but instead use longsword to better control their unit, so they take less risks. Longswords are the most popular and highly performing class right now, but have terrible stats all things considered. What this entails is the fact that Conqueror's Blade is turning into more of a game about unit control more than hero usage, and longswords are the go-to heroes for unit management. But it doesn't have to be just about their unit. My average tanking stats blow past the average of all other classes, and if you consider how block damage is encountered in the end screen, I'm taking double the damage of the average heavy armor player. Longswords have even higher potential that most people aren't tapping into. I can tell you the way to play longswords so you can not only deal decent damage, but also take the highest amount of damage without dying more than twice a game, all the while having more than 1000 assist points. In fact, out of the 16 games I recorded, I was top 5 in all but 2 of them where I got 6. So, have I piqued your interest? Let's dive into how I use my longswords. First, attributes and armor. I have an entire video on why you should use armor as your main defensive stat if you're a heavy armor user. You'll want to check that one out if you're interested. But specifically for the longsword, now that healing has a buff to armor and the previous burst skill, Sally Forth, has been gutted, the only way to build a longsword is to stack armor as much as you can. The more armor, the better. Sacrifice your damage stats if need be, as they will not be used other than blunt damage during Clash of Shields. So practically speaking, you want all your attributes in armor. Then for your armor sets, focus on getting leadership, then armor, preferably piercing and slashing. As for your weapon, you want armor, then blunt damage. Anything else is extra unless you have some great stats, like the weapon I use here. Lastly, the epic armor is worth your time only if you reforge it. It brings even higher armor and makes your Clash of Shields last almost twice as long, while having crowd control immunity. You'll just need to get lucky with your leadership roles. Alright, next are the skills I use. Martial Prowess is a skill that provides the highest levels of assistance in the entire game, because it lowers your enemy's armor up to 30%. Translated into relative damage increase, that's a 20% damage increase against most units, or up to 30% if they are a heavy armor class like Iron Reapers. This is important, so I'll say it again. Every 10 seconds, you can make any unit around you take at least 20% more damage for 6 seconds. And as if that's not enough, it has active block during the attack, so even against the hardest hitting units in the game, you can still dare to stand up to the attack radius and go in and debuff them. Let that be men-at-arms, Iron Reapers, or Japanese pikes. You can tank the damage with your full block. Just be extra careful that you do not have low block, because you will get pierced and take double damage. So when using this skill, you want to keep your shields lowered in battle unless you're blocking range damage to preserve your block. The worst thing that can happen to you is you're out of block and you've become soft locked from using the skill, because you get instantly block broken when you try to use it. This is true even if you try to recover from a stun. Low block may stun you again if you're not careful. Next, counterattack or Crusader counter. This is your main damage skill and the singular reason why longswords can deal so much damage without adding damage-based attributes. The key word here is bleed damage. The one limiting factor for longswords dealing damage is how low all the skills multi-hit scaling is. Back in the day when Sally Forth was the best ult, hitting more than one enemy usually gave you lackluster returns compared to other classes. But this skill is different, as it scales as much as the number of units you hit with the last area of effect damage. Hit one unit, that's 200 bleed for 5 seconds. Hit 10, that's 10,000 potential damage. Now, in a blob fight where you could hit up to 30 or more units at the same time, the effect quickly stacks up. This is basically the melee version of the dual blade bow shuriken, but with recovery and some hero stun at the start. Normally, going to the fight to deal damage against so many units is suicide, but as you all know, this is not the case if you use your armor during your heal. Let's talk about Mercy of Heaven. A single use of Mercy of Heaven heals you about 30% over 10 seconds. That's 1 tick of burst healing and 9 ticks of slower healing. If you play the longsword, you'll know that this is one of the best skills in the game. But what is rarely talked about nowadays is the armor buff it gives you, and to be honest, it's disturbingly good. There is a reason why my damage taken stats are so high, and it's because of the 50% armor buff that gets applied on cast, and 20% afterwards. So I have 1100 armor, and on cast I get 1600 armor. Against a men-at-arms cover commander charge skill that can kill almost any hero instantly, I gain 90% damage reduction against their meager 1600 armor penetration right after my heal. After initial cast, it drops my armor to 1300, or roughly the same as Iron Reapers, all the while healing. All this is to say, when you heal, you get a lot of damage reduction if you have high armor, up to 50% more on cast and at least 20% damage reduction during the heal, which can be further increased by hitting units with your skills. Knightly Vow is the other side of the skill. It's great at moving you to the next destination, but overwrites your armor buff, so unless you want to keep the buff of your team with the extra 6% damage reduction of your rune, it's better to keep your Mercy armor buff active for your own survival. Clash of Shields is the only ult usable in the longsword arsenal now that it has been heavily buffed while Sally Forth is dead. So what can you do with the skill? You can hit units without taking into account multi-hit. You could deal quite a lot of damage in a group. You have active block and depleting it does not force you into block break, so you become almost invincible from frontal attacks. You are still vulnerable to hero crowd control, but you can still easily live through it with your armor. But best of all, it disables some of the strongest units in the game like Hussar Chargers or Men-at-Arms, which can single-handedly change the outcome of a fight. It's a decent ultimate that becomes great with the epic longsword set, but does make you unable to use your units. So you will need some sort of cover commander unit if you still want to take some control of your units during the ultimate. Alright, that's about all you need to know about the longsword. Put everything into armor, use your skills to your advantage, and make sure to debuff the enemy while using your units to get the most out of the class. As for the other skills I've yet to mention, With Valor is the worst longsword skill if you run full tank. The damage does not scale well and it has no additional benefit other than making you an easy target. Shield Bash was a favorite of mine, but a lack of stun recovery makes it suboptimal, even if it can slow enemies down. As for Sally Forth, we don't talk about it. 10 extra seconds of extra cooldown as well as losing the ability to stun heroes on the first hit? Just no. And before I forget, the only 2 runes that you must use as a longsword is the damage reduction on Mercy and Vow, as well as the passive heal. I'll leave the damage per minute Google spreadsheet on the comments below if you want to take a better look at the stats. I hope this helps people to play the longsword better, and if the devs are listening, please bring back the old Sally forth. Thanks for listening. This was Alan Apogee.